Hi, everybody, and away we go with another edition of the Stampede Wrestling Show.
And with that, we welcome you into Hart Beat Radio with Bruce Hart. I'm your host, Patrick Ketza. On the line with us already, we have writer for Pro Wrestling Digest and the co-host of Legends Radio with Evan Ginsberg, Dr. Mike Lano. Mike, how are you tonight?
I'm doing great. It's always a thrill to hear Ed Whalen and the theme for the great Stampede Wrestling, which was absolutely one of the greatest territories. Let me, as Q knows, I'm going to quickly put myself over. I've been shooting and covering wrestling as a photographer, writer, reporter all around the globe for all the newsstand Mark magazines since 1966. The Los Angeles Mike LeBell territory, Cal Eaton territory was my home base. I've written my first article with photos in Pro Wrestling Illustrated, Kappa, London magazine. It was then the Wrestler and Inside Wrestling was back when I was a kid in '66. I'm pretty much everywhere. I still even freelance for the Whiffs. That's WWE's newsstand crappy magazine. Whenever they need old photos, like a Freddie Blassie. The last one they asked for was Freddie Blassie teaming with Lonnie Main in 1973, managed by Lou Albano. I have audio of them, all three trying to cut promos on each other, trying to hog the mic, the most amazing thing ever. But anyway, I'll shut up here.
Well, it won't have to be for too long, just so you know. The other gentleman joining us is a trainer, promoter, former wrestler, jack of all trades, trained several wrestlers. I wouldn't say most notably, but a couple of names I believe were Christian York and Joey Mercury, and that would be Cueball Carmichael. How are you tonight?
I'm good, Patrick. Don't make me have to reach to the phone and slap you because I wrestled 2 weeks ago and I'm booked all through the summer. So, not a former wrestler, still current.
And a great writer and a great blogger. Nobody knows wrestling like Cueball Carmichael.
Oh, thanks, Dr. Mike. It's a pleasure to be on there with you again. And we do Legends Radio once in a while together. And I always learn something. And you're a great historian of the business. And it's just great to be on with you again.
Not to cut you two gentlemen off, but I believe that the host of our show, Mr. Bruce Hart, has finally been able to join us. Bruce, how are you this evening?
Good. Great to hear Mike and Cueball and yourself. So how are you, Dr. Mike? It's been a while, and I always love to hear your perspectives. One of the most knowledgeable and most passionate wrestling people I know is Mike. So, I always learn a lot just from talking to him. It's always very enlightening.
Well, I appreciate that. Brother Bruce, I didn't get a chance to finish this when we were doing our Owen tribute, and you could do hours and hours and days in paying respect to your brother, who was the most amazing person besides, I'm talking about as a human being apart from being the athlete that Owen was. But maybe later we'll have a little time. I want to talk about Owen in Japan and Mexico and Europe beyond what people saw in Canada, which was, amazing, or in the U.S. Owen was just the absolute greatest. And the other thing was, I got cut off. I was trying to say every New Year's Day I used to call your folks for about 10 years in a row.
Oh yeah, they would have loved us.
That was their anniversary, and I still don't know, was it both or one of them or a main one? Was it Lord Blears or Paul? I think it was more Paul Bosch who introduced them in Long Island, New York.
Yeah, it was kind of funny. Paul Bosch was the one who he was the lifeguard on the beach out at Long Beach there in New York, and he knew Stu and he knew my mother, so he was the one who introduced them. And then Stu was rooming with Lord Blears and some other old guy who became a promoter named Sandor Kovacs, who was up.
Oh wow!
So Stu and Sandor and Lord Blears were rooming together in New York, and Paul Bosch was kind of the go-between, and there's a few other players in there. Old Angelo Savoldi was around then, and some of those other old Bull Curry and Wilbur Need and Baron Leone, and some of those guys who were all part of the landscape in New York in that era. So it's kind of interesting to hear some of the old stories that Stu had about all those guys, and funny how many of them went on to become like promoters and all that kind of stuff.
Well, did Stu have any, and Q will love this, because Bull Curry was one of the absolute most unique, just amazing individuals. I only saw him once against the Sheik in Detroit at Cobo when I was shooting, but obviously he had this legend all over the world, especially all over Texas. Did your dad have any great stories about Bull? Because what an incredible heel he was. Anything he did was amazing.
Yeah, Stu just told me he was a great worker. Stu told me he was a lot smaller than people may have thought. My dad said he didn't think he ever kept the scales at maybe more than 190 or 200 at the very most. But he seemed to sustain. And my dad's old Baron Leone was kind of a understudy of Bull, and he was just kind of working undercard around that time, and then he kind of headed to the West Coast around not long after that, and became a, as you would know, a huge box office sensation.
He was huge. He set the outdoor record cue ball against Thez. I've heard all kinds of worked figures, like 34,000 to 39,000 at an outdoor stadium near the beach in Hollywood. And Baron Michel Leone was like erudite and the fancy robes. He was like the ultimate, even more so than Lord Blears or Lord Leighton or any of those guys. And what a diametric opposite then to his roommate Bull Curry, who was like the king of hardcore. He was sort of like a shrimpy, hairy, mixed love child of George Steele and Mick Foley. It's kind of what, with a unibrow. He was like the first unibrowed wrestler before Santino Marella or any of these other guys. I mean, Bull Curry against the Sheik or against Abbey or Pampero Firpo, that was like main event city gold anywhere, because I know Cue Ball would have loved, and there isn't any footage. We were just asking a Cauliflower, and I'll get into that because, Bruce, your name came up quite a bit, and you were surpassed in terms of promos. I'll get into that in Vegas, but we were just talking about this, and there's no footage of Bull Curry that exists, which is criminal.
Oh, that's terrible. Let me ask you a question, Dr. Mike. Bruce mentioned Sandor Kovacs. Didn't he run the promotional office with Jules Strongbow for a while on the West Coast?
I don't know about that, if he came in and did a stint like Bobby Bruns, but the thing that Sandor's known for is mainly is promoting Vancouver on and off.
Yeah, he was up there with
Kiniski and Don Leo Jonathan. I don't remember
Gene
him in the
Kiniski
office.
And Rod Fenton back in the 60s there. They were, I never knew of Sandor being in L.A. I thought that was
maybe he's thinking of Sandor Szabo, who was in that group he was the guy that was in the office with Jules Strongbow.
Yeah, there was kind of a mix of Cal Eaton and Strongbow and LeBell and...
that was later. Cal Eaton unified them all. They were all kind of promoting, not trying to kill each other, but they were all promoting different parts of Southern California, like Hollywood Legion Stadium, etc. With syndicated TV was Jules, and the Olympic Auditorium was the Davis brothers, and then San Diego, I believe, was Pete Collins. They were different, and then Cal Eaton brought them all together and then had Jules Strongbow first as his lead booker, and then he paired him with retired, he retired about 62, Charlie Mr. Moto, and they were like the absolute best dream tag team of booking. They were brilliant. They brought in Moskris, for example, in 1967, and created the whole Tolis Blassie, all of that stuff, and then both kind of were unceremoniously dumped by my big overall boss, Mike LeBell, in like 74, and that's when Louis Tillet came in and nearly killed the territory.
Yeah, gotcha. I was wondering. I didn't know all the... I'm glad you're sort of filling in some of the gaps there. So I remember my dad told me that was, some phenomenal stuff going there, and I remember hearing the name Hugh Nichols too, and then I guess he committed suicide or something like that, and there's a few others, and there was a few dynamics I never quite ever understood, some of the...
Well, Cal Eaton loved the business and was a gentleman, sort of like a Vince McMahon Sr. type guy with none of the bad qualities.
He was married to Eileen
Mike LeBell,
Eaton.
when he died, and then his stepson, he was married to Eileen Eaton, who was the queen of boxing. and her 2 kids from a previous marriage to some LeBell guy, I think Peter LeBell, Gene and Mike. Everybody loved Gene, the judo king, and he was a pro wrestler, just super nice, still legendary.
He's still
guy.
Around,
he's going to be corner man in Vegas. He didn't come to Cauliflower because in about
Ronda Rousey or whatever.
Yeah, he's corner man. I emailed your whole family. He's going to be corner man for Ronda at a UFC. But so Mike takes over, and they sort of get that going with the Bobo Brazil Broadway with Gene Kiniski to drop the WWA World Championship, and then it's unified with Gene and the NWA. And then the whole, battling against Vern Gagne when he came into the L.A. Forum, and Mike is begging Sam Munch to send him guys, and I can get into that. But it culminates with what Bruno Sammartino, who I still talk to once a month, told me about what he really felt Mike LeBell was not a great promoter at all. A lot of stuff fell into Mike's laps.
Gene can't stand him.
No.
It was like major.
You mean Gene Kiniski?
Oh, no, Gene LeBell and...
They
Mike
stopped speaking because Mike cheated his own brother on money and stole money from Gene and did all this stuff. I mean, towards the end, Mike LeBell, I got these flyers, I still have them, where he was bootlegging porn from his garage and, other sports tapes. But, it's like how the high and mighty have fallen. He was the alleged promoter of both Olympic Auditorium boxing and wrestling. But so Bruno Sammartino comes in. He does our battle royal. This is when he asked Vince Sr. to get some time off from the strap. And he comes in, does our battle royal, the absolute best battle royal ever. The only time in history Bruno and Neil Moskowitz laid hands on each other was in the 22-man L.A. battle royal, I believe January 21st, 1972.
Well, that used to be
he comes back
all over the business. You'd hear about the L.A.
Well,
battle
Bruno
royal.
comes back. Basically, he has a match 2 months later with Killer Kowalski. That's 45-minute Broadway. Absolutely incredible. They were just shy of a sellout. And he says to Mike, he goes, well, when we come back in 2 weeks, I know we're going to have a sellout. We had that crowd in the palm of my hands. And he tells me, Mike LeBell said, well, I wasn't even watching the match. I was just in the box office counting the money. And that's when Bruno said, you know what? Not coming back in 2 weeks, I quit. He just felt Mike did not respect the business, and that's it's a truism. Bruno got it right on the nose.
It's too damn bad, because they had a great thing going on there, and all they needed to do was kind of not mess with it or screw it up, and it's too damn bad. I remember back in the day, that was one of the big events in the year. Everyone, even in Calgary and all the other territories, would always be kind of hearing about the big battle royal in L.A., that was kind of a big event in the calendar of wrestling everywhere, they made a real big thing about it. It's too bad.
Well, it's neat because the way we were situated, it's sort of like Calgary much later on, or maybe not so much later on, but Calgary became the melting pot for everybody around the world to finesse guys, particularly Japan. But the San Francisco, so we have a lot of guys going and coming, either to Honolulu or Japan, of course, going and coming. But Roy Shire's battle royals were, when I started going up to cover those, and I went to more and more, and then I was actually I was named as Roy's official Cow Palace photographer, even though I lived in L.A. I'd come up 5-6 times a year for the better shows, always the battle royal. And Roy was unusual in that he would put his battle royal on no other promoter, not even Vern Gagne with his end-of-the-year card, and that was always a battle royal, versus L.A. and San Francisco that started the very first card of the year in January was their battle royal after taking about 3-4 weeks off for the holidays. Roy would put his battle royal on first. Everybody had theirs on, at the end, the main event, the end thing. Roy did that because a lot of guys didn't want to wrestle on the undercard after the battle royal. They wanted to get to the airport and go to Japan, and then Roy wouldn't have to pay them, double for working 2 matches. And then they would have all these advertised matches that were supposed to occur, dream matches like the Sheik against Dory Jr. after the battle royal, or Harley Race against the Sheik, or Brody against Harley Race. And then they would come out and say after the battle royal is over, Bruce Brody was injured in the battle royal, and his place in the match will be taken by Earl Maynard or something like that. And so,
wow. And
this would happen in almost every single match that followed the opening match battle royal. How can you? That's like the 1994 ECW Cueball, and then I'll shut up. November to Remember, and I go out there in the opening match of this terrific card. How do you follow? Double Juice. It was a double chain, double juice with the Pitbulls against Ian and Axel Rotten. All 4 guys bleeding, And that's kind of what having a battle royal on as your opening match. It's like, how can you follow that? And these battle royals were good. They weren't all Japan type boring battle royals where everybody's just getting tossed out, willy-nilly and fast. They would make a big deal, and the boys would back up when they'd see Bruno and Moskers, for example, put hands on each other, or Bruno and John Tolis, which was like the dream of everybody in L.A. to see. And the boys would back up, and so it really had meaning versus I think a lot of today's battle royals, can suck because they don't take that. Just everybody is doing everything. And
no, they're almost anxious to get out as fast as they can. It's just a hodgepodge of meaningless nonsense. But I was going to ask you, Big Mike, what was the relationship back in those days between Frisco and L.A.? We used to always hear speculation that LeBell and Shires weren't always on the best of terms. There was some. I remember old Buddy Austin came up for us in the 70s, and he was telling my dad there was some kind of rift between the two promotions or something. But I never knew what was the deal there. They never seemed like they had the same style, or they never seemed like they were always supporting each other or whatever,
No, that's absolutely true, and I don't want to hog too much time from Cueball. There were different periods of stuff that would go on because San Francisco was sort of like the San Francisco roller derby in that it was more athletic, and then in Los Angeles you had roller games, which was more theatric and less in terms of great athleticism. I can just throw out names like Ray Stevens and Dr. Big Bill Miller, for example. Amazing matches. And for the longest time, LeBell would send guys up. Shire would request X amount of guys, and he would say to Mike, can this guy work? Can Raul Mata work? And later on, 10 years later, can Hector and Mondo Guerrero work? And Shire would bring them up, and more often than not, he would job them out. He often jobbed out Tolis on TV, who was our main event, our lead champion. Even Moskers, you never put him in much of a, just like third match in, no fanfare, nothing. There were just very few guys that were even in great positions, and it's because Roy Shire allegedly had no respect for Mike LeBell at all. Mike was not a wrestler; he was born into it. He hadn't paid his dues, according to Shire, and and then when Shire, the few times Shire would send down talent, like he sent Paul DeMarco and Lars Anderson down, and they're in the main event against Bobo Brazil, and let's see, that was Bobo against Lars and DeMarco against Victor Rivera. So LeBell would sort of kowtow because he was afraid of, allegedly, Roy Shire. And any San Francisco guy sent down the 400 miles to Southern Cal was put in a good spot and well promoted, versus Shire instead would just job most of the guys on TV. Even Blassie came up, and Blassie obviously would play a deferential role in like 67, 68. They often put him in really amazing, I think it was 68, three-man tags with Stevens and Pat. So you'd have Stevens, Pat, and Blassie as sort of the guy no one had ever heard of, which was kind of a shame in San Francisco. But
yeah, it's a shame because those are like iconic names.
But later on, real icons. But later on, Mike tried to F with Roy, and he tried to go into Reno and Vegas. And towards the end, when our territory was really blowing chunks and awful, in 81 and 82, he even had the balls to try to go into San Jose, which was always a Roy Shire territory, promoted by his policeman. And I know Cueball knows what I'm talking about. His policeman, John Swinsky, who was, a great wrestler and NWA World Junior Champion, a million years ago.
Yeah, I still knew him over in Al Haft's territory back in the 40s.
They were there along with Savoldi, with Angelo Savoldi. But yeah, I mean, Cueball, did you used to, if you looked at the old we call them the Stanley Weston, later the After magazines, there was often, particularly those battle royals in the early 70s, but they'd often have the covers. It was all LA stuff.
I remember a lot of that stuff because at that particular time I had a keen interest in wrestling. Obviously I wasn't in it yet, but I remember all the magazines would cover stuff that, being a kid raised in upstate New York, where my real only exposure to television wrestling was actually the Tri-WF, and so I would see all this stuff from California in the magazine covers, and later the NWA and the Mid-South and stuff, And it was, it was sort of foreign to me until 80 or 81 when I started watching Georgia Championship Wrestling. But I remember, realizing very young that the wrestling world was much larger than what I was seeing on television.
And the weird thing was Shire at different times had heat with Vince Sr., and he really was upset when Mike LeBell kind of just pushed the NWA to the side and kind of went with he shifted from the NWA-affiliated All Japan Baba's group to Inoki's New Japan group, and then really got tight. I guess Shire maybe was jealous knowing Roy, because he did my TV show about 14 times, and he was often pretty blunt with stuff that he'd say. And I think he called Mike one time a little prick when I asked him about the same question Bruce asked. But Mike was way up Vince Sr.'s butt at various times in the 70s, and was even named before Hisashi Shinma was named the figurehead vice president of the Tri-WF. Mike LeBell, I think briefly, was also called a VP for Vince Sr.'s company.
Oh, yeah.
And this was before they joined. Vince Sr. went back and joined the NWA and started going to those conventions, which was pretty amazing.
Yeah, I went to a few of those meetings, and Mike LeBell was always going out of his way to make everyone well aware that he and Vince Sr. were super tight or whatever, I don't know what I think he was trying to make everyone think that he had Vince Sr. in his pocket or vice versa, or something. But yeah, he never seemed to be, I can't recall anyone ever speaking well of him,
No,
most cases,
Vince Sr. would also send a lot of his job guys. He sent Joe Nova, a.k.a. Butcher Brannigan, and told Mike to really finesse him, make him a star. He sent Roberto Soto and Pork Chop Cash and a lot of guys that came in and were put in main event positions. But anybody that was getting our TV, the Spanish version, not the good Saturday Night Dick Lane version, but the Spanish International one that was narrated by Miguel Alonso and Luis Magana, they would see all of their jobbers in main event slots, so A, they would either look and laugh, or B, when those guys came back home, like even Victor Rivera, they were bigger stars. So it kind of was similar to a Calgary Stew situation where Japanese groups would send green piss boys to Calgary. They'd get finessed and come back as heroes with respect from doing Calgary. It's sort of a warped comparison of L.A. to Calgary, which was a great territory at all times.
Yeah,
I'm training a young guy who moved here from Finland a while ago, and he contacted me years ago about training, and I didn't think he was serious. And he's lived here and he's lived there, but he moved from Finland here about a year ago, and got a job, got a car, got citizenship, and he's training with me. And 2 weeks ago, he stopped by my house, and I said, I've got to show you something you got to study. And of course, I pulled up Stampede Wrestling, and that is his current field of study for the next few weeks.
I'm flattered. Hopefully he was seeing some of the guys that Dynamite and some of those guys that when they were
Absolutely.
In their heyday, those guys were the cutting edge.
Well, you know what? It's weird when I train a guy. I trained Joey Mercury and Christian York, and back then in the mid '90s, we were lucky to get a second gen VHS tape and have somebody study it and things. But what a lot of people don't understand now is the training on a whole is worse because everybody's got a training center on a corner, and I don't know if anybody's seen it, if Dr. Mike's seen it, we're friends on Facebook. One of the things I always say is, if the guy training you is a guy who at best wrestles twice a month on the indies in front of 100 people, he's going to train you to do the same thing because he can't train you. If he hasn't been to the show or he has a history of putting guys there, he isn't really going to be able to train you to do anything but what he's done. So with these guys, I took a kid who wrestled as J.C. North, who did really well, short career, 5, 6, 7 years, and got out of the business, but did a lot of NWA Wild Side and a lot of stuff down south, and I trained him up north. But this is a kid that I made ride with me for a year. It was a funny story. I told him that he had to drive me for a year before I would train him. He was a young Marine in Northern Virginia, and where I lived up there, and the first day he showed up in the middle of a snowstorm, he's got a brand new car. I'm like, what'd you do, buy a new car? He goes, well, I figure if I got to drive you for a year, I might as well drive you in style. And I said, you know what, kid, you're probably going to make it in the business. And, you know, I had him drive me for a year, and I took him into locker rooms, and I taught him locker room respect, and I would take a chair and put it in the corner, tell him to sit there and shut up and just listen. And, you know, ended up after 6 or 7 months, I trained him, and he had a short career, but he had a great career, worked a lot of names, Just Incredibles, guys like that. Did really, really well for himself, and he's still a very close personal friend of mine. And, you know, I guess the thing with that is, you know, training, and nowadays they have access to so much stuff that's available on YouTube and the internet to watch, to learn and study from. But as I talk to guys who train don't train them on anything but, you know, training to me is not taking a bump. You know, I mean, you know, to me, moves in wrestling are a means to an end. You know, the transitions and the psychology and the story that you tell is really the real wrestling, and the other stuff is the necessary stuff you got to do. And, you know, as things progress and you have a program with somebody or something, you have to do more things in the ring. But, you know, it's as far as training goes these days, guys have access to so much stuff. And being able to take this kid and show him Stampede Wrestling on the internet in the heyday of guys like Dynamite and a young Owen and Brat and stuff like that, because, you know, these guys have all, you know, a guy this age, he's 24, 25, he's seen, you know, stuff from the 90s of Brat and Owen and things like that. But to take him back and show him the stuff that they were involved in, and Davey Boy and Jimmy and stuff they were involved in early in their careers, I think is incredibly advantageous compared to guys like me who had pretty much nothing, and guys who I trained originally who had VHS second-gen tape. So, you know, I think there's a lot of stuff out there to really help guys and propel them to be better. It just doesn't seem to be a lot of people doing that.
I think one of the things that's really lacking these days, it's something that they don't have anymore. Back in the day, virtually every territory, you know, Calgary or Amarillo or Louisiana and Oklahoma and all those places, you had to go on the road with these guys and travel the 500 miles one way to a town and all like that. But it was incredible how much you learned in the captive audience in a car or a van or whatever the hell, and you'd have all these old guys like the Cuban Assassin and Cyclone Negro and all these knowledgeable old farts that had been around the business for an eternity, and they would school you. You know, they'd watch your match, and sometimes they weren't that diplomatic, I might add. You know, they'd be chewing your ass out over your mistakes or why did you do this, but it was incredible.
I saw Roy Shire do that to Woody Farmer, who was a longtime veteran, but he was a journeyman. Yeah. This was as late as 1980. Roy just ripped into him and made the poor guy cry. He just ripped in, said you had an S match, and it sucks. I never want to see you again. It worked for me. Let you do this.
I remember as I said before, it wasn't always that diplomatic. Sometimes you'd be riding back all the way from Regina to Calgary, which is like 500 miles, and you'd have half a dozen guys, you know, why the fuck did you do that? Or, you know, like, you know, you go to cell before you come back, or, you know, how come you know, trying to do high spots when you haven't done any wrestling and all this kind of stuff, you know. And it was just sort of the norm back then, you know, and I don't think they have that anymore, you know. Like back in the day, it was sort of you know, every week you're maybe doing 2,000 miles a week up here in Calgary, or I know I did Amarillo and Kansas City and Portland and some of those other places, and same kind of thing, you know. And there was always some knowledgeable old veterans who would, you know, give you some advice, and it was a big part of the learning process is just sort of picking the brains of these old veterans. Sometimes you get a guy like Lou Thez up here, or some of those old icons, and they're always pretty generous with their advice and perspectives. And that's something that's missing these days, you know, just being schooled by the old guys, you know. And I can't imagine, you learning anywhere near as much as I learned if I hadn't had that. And it was more of a drudgery back then, I might add. It was like 2,000 miles a week, week in, week out, sometimes in 40 below weather and all that kind of stuff. So it wasn't
everybody says the Stews territory was, other than Verne's, was one of the roughest. Verne, you might drive to Manitoba and then Chicago and then et cetera. It was insane. The drives, the length of the drives, and then the weather conditions in the winter were bad.
Oh yeah, driving through the mountains, Calgary to Vancouver, in the middle of winter, and it's like 700 miles one way, and you had to, sometimes be speeding or whatever just to make the next day, and all that kind of stuff. But I remember it being an incredible opportunity to share perspectives. One of the good things about Stu's territory and why the wrestling was as good as it was is it seemed to be a melting pot for all these different styles, like the British, and he had a pronounced Japanese style, and then he'd have some of the guys from Eastern Canada, like Ontario and Quebec and the Maritimes, and then you'd have a few of these guys from Tennessee, like David Schultz and Honky Tonks, and then you'd have a guy like Ron Starr, and maybe Dory or Terry Funk would be up there, or Harley, and everyone. It kind of was a blending or a homogenous, style that everyone sort of added their little bits and pieces, and so. That's one of the things I think even WWE these days, their style has almost become kind of a stereotypical, stagnant style that, doesn't change, and if and when they bring Japanese guys or Europeans, they try to make them abandon that style and, do the WWE style, and Stampede.
Which is just bland. It's so unwatchable. That's probably why they pop and go crazy when these guys can break out and do one or two moves they don't usually see, like Bryan Danielson or CM Punk or the three guys in the
Mexicans.
Shield. Yeah, it just blows them away.
Totally
but how can you
agree.
bring a guy like Yoshitatsu in and have him disregard all the Japanese stuff and the hard kicks, the Kawada-type kicks, and then have him wrestle, just as you said, that homogeneous, boring, bland WWE.
I know when we brought Dynamite and those guys in, we were encouraging Dynamite to do his British stuff, and it was cutting edge, state of the art stuff, and it got over huge, and you'd bring in a guy, some of the Japanese guys, we brought in all the big Japanese stars, but you're always telling them to do their thing, and you'd have the Japanese and the British, and you maybe have, that's where we even started the triple threat matches, and that was like Dynamite and Cobra and I think Brett, so it was like three different styles that were all kind of different, yet they were all pretty entertaining, and they brought the best out of each other, and I don't see that anymore, and it's I think part of the arrogance and the egocentricity or the tunnel vision of the WWE, where they don't want to embrace anything other than their own stuff.
They want control over everything. I'll tell you something new they're doing. We all know they've been really trying to acquire footage and stuff. I turned them down. I have ownership of some Roy Shire and Mike LeBell, 2 different territories footage. I politely said no. And I still freelance when they need old photos. I was there at the beginning of their magazine because my L.A. territory boss, my immediate boss under Mike LeBell, was his publicist, Jeff Walton. He was the first WWF magazine editor. And after about 6-8 months, Vince Jr. asked him to move back to Stamford. He said, otherwise you can't be my editor. And Jeff turned him down. But they're also trying to acquire from all kinds of photographers. I won't name names, but they want to purchase their photo library. And they came to me, though. I should be flattered. They came to me first, I guess, about 6 years ago. Frank Vitucci, who was my boss editor at the PWI magazines, and then he moved to WWE's magazine. And they made this offer, but it was kind of low. And I said, you mean I won't be able to Sports Illustrated needs an obituary photo or somebody I took 30 years ago, or this or that I can't use or sell them. So they said, no, you can't. So I didn't want to lose my rights, and I just don't think they should get their hands on everything. They're getting all of the top indie guys, let alone footage, let alone now they want photos, which is weird because they have a relationship with PWI Magazine, the only U.S. newsstand magazine that's left out of, all. We had like 16 titles in the 70s on the newsstands. Now it's just the every other month Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and that's the last one left. And they normally can just ask PWI for any photos they want and get them for their DVDs or TV. And in return, for small house shows where there's no HD television cameras, they'll allow some of us to shoot ringside who work for PWI. So that's the arrangement. So I don't know why, if they can get for free, or maybe they pay a yearly stipend to PWI. I'm not sure why they want to acquire this, but I think they just want to acquire everything possible, and it's just
monopoly,
kind of grotesque.
Yeah, I think
good for you, Dr. Mike, for saying no.
Yeah, I think it ultimately will, hasten their demise if they do that. I've long felt that way. It's in their best interests if some independent entities are still thriving. It's actually better for them. It's better to have all these divergent, different, diverse aspects of wrestling rather than everything being the same cookie cutter style that it unfortunately has evolved into today.
But there's no true developmental anymore. And when whether you go back to when Vince Jr. started raiding, territories or independents or whatever and picking up talent, or you go back to OVW, or when there was, Smoky Mountain, when there was true development leagues, guys would wrestle. And I say this all the time. You learn in a wrestling school, you develop in front of a live crowd. And when you have guys out there working 5 nights a week, whether the crowd is 75 or 750, if you have guys out there with the right mindset, trained properly, working in front of these crowds, the way it used to be, 5 shows a week, if a guy stayed in developmental for a year, he wrestled on 250 to 300 shows in that year. I mean, you cannot help but develop. Either you develop or you wash out. There's no in between. And when that guy's been in front of those people for a year or two, and he goes up top, he's used to working in front of people. He's got a little creative control over what he does in the ring. And more importantly, and Bruce and I talked about this earlier, if you get a guy that can get over working in that developmental, there's a pretty good chance he can get over up there. And the thing that's missing nowadays is guys don't know how to get over. They have no clue. They listen to what they're told. They do things by a script. And if you look at the broad spectrum, the big thing that's missing in the business, whether you go to TNA or to WWE, is guys cannot get over. And they can't get over because they're not being put, in my opinion, not being put through the right training. They don't understand. And then they don't go into the developmental program and get those 200 or 300 shows. I've always said the magic number to me, and this is just something that's been stuck in my head for 20 years since I started training people, or going back 30 when I got trained. When you get in front of 300 shows where you're getting paid to go out there and wrestle, and I'm not talking over 20 years, I'm talking 300 shows in 2 years or less. When you get in front of that many people, or 2.5 years, you develop and you understand how to get over as a wrestler. And that's what's missing today. No developmental guys don't know how to get over. That's a huge thing that's missing. There's a lot of other things, but that's one of the big things in my opinion.
And another big part of it is when you're developing, you should not be developing under the scrutiny of WWE fans. Like in the old days, if you were breaking in, you'd go to one territory and maybe another territory or 2 or 3. Most of the guys that evolved into the big stars, they had worked Calgary and maybe Portland and Kansas City and Amarillo. There was always these territories that were considered like the good territories to break in. And when they finally hit WWE or Crockett's territory, one of those places, they were finished product, ready for stardom, all that other, and they hit the ground running. They should actually be supporting these smaller territories, just sending these guys out and telling them to sink or swim on their damn merits. If you're paying guys, and to me it's ass backwards to give a guy a big contract, sign him because he's a musclehead or got some ability to talk or whatever the hell. There's no incentive. In the old days, when guys were breaking in, there was no safety net there and everything. They had to bust their asses to get over, but it was, it made them try harder, and they were seeking to learn and all like that. And I don't see that now. I know WWE back in the day used to send a lot of these so-called projects up to Calgary, and guys like Outback Jack and Dave Barbie and Ted Arcidi, guys like that, and WWE was subsidizing them. Scolin's kid was another one, Strongbow's kid, and all like that. And they didn't have any hunger. They're almost arrogant. They didn't want to be told what to do, and none of them ever made it because their attitude was kind of skewed to start with. And the same thing's happening today.
Which is weird because you look at your own niece, Natty Neidhart, and there is no ego there, and she's always been like the consummate professional, in my opinion. I saw her work on some indie shows before she got called up because originally, as you know, it was going to be a 3 pairing with Teddy and Davey's kid. It was going to be the 3 of them coming in, and Teddy kind of whatever happened there, and then it was just those 2 and I think TJ. So they kind of shifted it a little bit, But you look at her, and she really made Flair's daughter, who was as green as shit, if I can cuss. Sounds like I can.
Yeah, you can.
Married her about 2 weeks ago.
Holy
but
shit.
let me throw something out there that will blow Q's mind a little bit. In the old days, and I'm talking from when I started at least shooting ringside in '66, the adage was, it takes like 7 years before you'll become a decent worker, and that means work in, territories, as many house shows and TV, everything. 7 years. And you look at somebody like Bob Orton Jr., and he spent, he was a journeyman for a long, long time, was in opening matches for Eddie Graham, and, slowly worked his way up, and that's how it was, as long as 7 years. And at Cauliflower Alley in Vegas, Terry Taylor told this story, how Jerry Briscoe told him, like he told Steamboat and others, you got to leave. You got to leave to save yourself, because if you job every single night, that's all you're going to be. You're never going to be or raised to the next level.
Well, it's amazing how many of them started in very humble beginnings. Ric Flair was one of Vern's squash guys back in the day.
Chubby, and he was chubby and fat. He was way, way fat. He was nobody you would even pay any attention to.
Yeah, I remember him and Paul Pershman, alias Buddy Rose, and Iron Sheik and Scrap Iron.
I've got a great story. Before I forget, Paul Pershman, Vern sends him, it's like 73, December 73. He sends him to the AWA-affiliated group in Japan, the IWE, Russia Kimura, Gozo Kobayashi, and Thunder Sugiyami. He sends him over there, guys, just to get a little finessing. And he comes in to do some TV for Mike LeBell on the way to Japan in Los Angeles for us. And we had a jobber from Phoenix, Cowboy Buddy Rose, who did a gay cowboy act wearing all pink chaps, pink boots, tights, cowboy hat.
Oh, man.
And that's where he took the name, from gay wrestler or doing a gay act, Cowboy Buddy Rose from Phoenix, Billy Anderson's neck of the woods. And he goes over there, and he, comes back, and he always had that. And he admitted it to me when I had him on my old cable access show. I don't know. It was so much better about, I don't know, Bruce and guys, how many years ago was it? Maybe 15 years ago, instead of just Florida, they had developmentals. They had Deep South, which then was located with Jody Hamilton in Georgia. They had Victor Quinones's group in Puerto Rico. They had Rick Bassman's in Los Angeles, obviously OV-Dub or wherever Cornette was with his genius.
Yeah, right.
And in part, maybe some stuff in Japan. So they had at least...
And they even had a bit of stuff going on in...
And of course they stole everything out of Calgary. They used Calgary for their own purposes. So they at least had, quote-unquote, farm systems in different places, different styles, different audiences. Now, it's just Florida, and it sucks. It's they're just not going to learn.
All it is
as much
these
as
days, I hate to say it, is there's a few old guys probably gouging guys' training camp tuition fees, and then they got a few of their kids and their friends of their kids or whatever that they're pushing, which is why you see like Rotundo's kids or Dusty's kids or DiBiase's kids or whatever. And but yeah, it's there's something there's a lot of things that are lacking there, and I think WWE.
But it is worlds better than Buzz Sawyer's school. Buzz Sawyer, when he had left the South and he was in the Sacramento area, he would take guys' money. This was a couple of years before he passed. He would take guys' money. Then he would stretch the shit out of them, and then he would say, "Well, sorry, I guess you weren't tough enough for wrestling," and he'd already have their money. So that was the nice thing. So obviously, it's certainly a better situation than some of the stuff like that, or having someone who has some of these crumb-bum indie guys that no one's ever heard of. They had some character out here in Northern Cal, the American Eagle, Paul Brown, who was a complete rip-off artist. He would take money from schools, not put on shows, all this stuff. But here's a guy who admitted only learning by watching from TV, and then he's taking people's money to train. So this was various people said, including Reggie Parks in Vegas, you can only get as good potentially as your trainer. If your trainer sucks, you can, you may not even be as, get to that guy's level, and that guy sucked.
If you ever pick a wrestling school based on price or geography, you're in trouble already. When I went to train, in fact, Mike, didn't Woody Farmer have a school in San Francisco years ago? 30 years ago.
Yeah, Woody had one. Alexis Smirnoff, who I just saw a couple of days ago, had one. Even Roy Shire's jobbers, Jerry Monty, and Ricky Thompson was the initial trainer. He was just a Shire jobber forever for some 20 years. He was the first instructor at APW, All Pro Wrestling.
Right, because when I was going to train, I remember, there were for options for me, there was the Harts, which, in retrospect, you kind of wish you went to, but raised in upstate New York, I'm like, God, the winters are worse in Calgary. I don't want to go there. And then there was Burns, and then it's a true story, Bruce. I was going to come. And then there was Peters in Hawaii, which was training people at Palama Settlement. That's where I ended up going. And I people don't understand. 1982. There was no cell phones, and there was no computers. There was no internet, and
there wasn't any dirt sheets or smart mark sheets or any of that either. Back then.
Right.
But wait, who trained you in Hawaii? Lars Anderson?
Yeah, no, I didn't train under Lars. That's a misnomer. If you read the internet, it says that. But I trained at Peter's Palama Settlement Gym. Peter had passed that year. But I trained with Ossie and Farmer Boy Ipo and Ernie Stevens and Diamond Fanini, and Leah Maivia supervised my training. It was really good to me. And those guys, they were incredibly good to me.
Oh, don't trust. I just talked to Ada at length about that, and she admits that her mom owes so many people money. When she brought in, did you work those shows? She brought in her Hawaii group to San Jose for maybe 4 or 5 shows. She had TV running here. And they brought in, at least at the HIC, now it's called Blaisdell. She had some super cars. So she had Sullivan bring in Brody and Mark Lewin.
She brought Mark Lewin in. Tor Kamada was there, but she brought Steve Ricard used to come in from Australia. I think he kind of co-promoted with her because my first match there, I tagged with him. But
they had a major falling out.
Yeah, but back in those days, I moved 5,000 miles from where I was born and raised. I didn't know anybody there. I had no friends, no relatives. I left everybody behind. But that, to me, I wanted to be in the business, so I packed up and I sold my snowmobiles and my car and everything I had and moved 5,000 miles away to train. And now you see guys, they complain because they got to drive 100 miles. And when I trained with Lou Thez, I lived in Northern Virginia. It was 180 miles to Lou's camp. And I went down 4 days a week and trained with Lou and Mark Fleming, for 9 months.
Wow.
So, and guys
Mark
nowadays
Fleming
don't want
a great guy.
Oh, Mark Fleming was unbelievable. I always said that if champions were based on skill and ability versus charisma and gimmicks, that he would probably be the world champion for a very long time because he was incredible.
Let me show this card at you from Honolulu I shot in '72. It'll blow your mind away. The opening match, Mil Mascaras against Mad Dog Vachon, and I'm going to go back up now to the top. The top of the card was Sheik against Terry Funk in a First Blood match. It went all over the HIC arena. Next was for the AWA Tag Championship. Nick and Ray defending against, listen to this, Bobo Brazil and Pedro Morales. Wow. Then you had a battle royal, the first time ever that Giant Baba and Andre the Giant were ever in the same ring together in Honolulu at the HIC arena. Curtis Ayakea against Ripper Collins. You had Handsome Johnny Barron, I think, against Fred Blassie. Lonnie Main was on the card, second match up. I think, I forget who he worked with. So it's just one of those amazing shows. And who was backstage at Bruno Sammartino? He didn't work the show. He didn't come out to the ring, wasn't introduced. He just happened to be on his way to Japan for Baba, and he was on the beach to get tan, so he wanted to take a little break, go to Honolulu. So he's in back. So can you imagine all of these guys in the back, all complete legends?
Well, who was that? Ed Francis still?
Yeah, it was Ed Francis and Blears, Lord Blears promoting that stuff. This was right before they, I guess, went to primarily AWA TV with Blears doing cutaway interviews locally that they would just edit in and insert, which was a shame because their own little studio was absolutely out of this world with guys like Pampero Firpo and Sammy Steamboat and just the list on and on. Tons of guys. The guys would just pour back and forth. But that's what happened. Once he started utilizing Verns, the weirdest Styles Clash match ever for the Area Top Championship, the Ring Magazine Gold Belt, champion Billy Robinson against Fred Blassie. Blassie refuses to sell for anything Billy was doing.
It was a shame.
Billy didn't make himself.
Hawaii used to be, guys would actually have to cajole and beg and kiss ass to even get a shot in there. Like it was kind of like common where they were trying to get a shot in Hawaii on the way to Japan or on the way back, and Francis would pick and choose, over.
When he'd have sellouts, it was always sold out. He has a new book that's been out in the last year. It's just wonderful. Tons of great photos, everything. He talks about how he was kind of pushed out of the way by Liam Maivia, and his territory was kind of going downhill. He was only utilizing towards the end, around 78, Don Owen guys from Oregon, which was basically what Shire was doing in San Francisco. So that's why you saw the first pairing of Jesse Ventura and Adrian Adonis and Steve Strong from your territories.
Oh, yeah.
And stuff like that. The cards, and Steve was under the wing of Tolis. Tolis took Calgary Steve Strong under his wing and teamed with him and kind of was showing him the ropes because John loved getting tan and he loved chasing after girls. And you had that in
Tolis is always down around there. And they had a bunch of guys that were just sort of half living there. Morocco was there a lot, and old Steiger and that Billy White Wolf, General Adnan, and a bunch of those guys were. But
the neat thing was watching the guys come from the dressing room was the only place in the world even the heels would wear flower leis, so it really had a celebratory, a different look to it, similar to in Japan. No matter what the promotion was, they give bouquets of flowers and sashes to, particularly in the 70s, to these guys, and it was just so colorful. It just what an amazing territory Honolulu was, just alone.
They had a unique style there. I remember just hearing about guys like Johnny Barand and King Curtis and some of those guys. And
everybody swears that King Curtis did the absolute best promos ever. Nick Bockwinkel said in like the late 60s, the camera would come in and slowly get closer and closer. Curtis Ayakea had his back turned to the camera, and he was doing one of those, the first ever to do a promo like that, and his voice, starts soft.
Oh, yeah, he had that
giant bellow. And Bockwinkel swears the greatest promo guy in the world, this is before Nick sadly started getting Alzheimer's, just was Curtis Ayakea. Nobody even came close to his level. He was doing state-of-the-art promos. Then he comes into the Tri-WF, and who do they let do most of his talking but Lou Albano, who was not bad, but you get Curtis Ayakea, just let him talk.
Yeah, I remember in the States it was the same with, not sure if you're familiar with him, old Archie Goldie, the Stomper, but
He didn't talk. He was in many territories. They had him silent, and they'd have like a guy who couldn't talk.
Playing a Mongolian or something. He was like
Mongolian
one of the best.
Stomper. I was going to ask you, but so they have a shitty talker who can't even talk his way out of a paper bag. He's like Booker T, but to the worst level. And I'm not being racist here, but Sonny King just sometimes he's a very sweet guy, good worker, but he had a mouth like a bag of marbles. Unlike a very eloquent guy like Ernie Ladd, who was absolutely one of the all-time great promo guys, besides being a tremendous wrestler on every level. But they would pair Mongolian Stomper or even Don Carson, who was not that good at all. But so Bruce, he would cut his own promos and stuff in Calgary. Tell us a little about Archie Goldie.
One of the most riveting and intense, awe-inspiring promos I ever heard is Stomper. You know, he was almost like scary. We were all obviously with it, but his promos when he was working with guys like Stu or Billy Robinson and all were so kind of over the top that you're almost pinching yourself and wondering if he was shooting, you know, because he sounded so damn convincing and real. And I've often wondered what was the deal down in the States, because he never ever spoke at all down there. You know, he was always playing a Mongolian or some kind of a freak or whatever who couldn't. They always had.
Well, they did that with Lewin. They did that with Mark Lewin once he, got hooked up with
playing a lunatic or whatever.
Allegedly, the drugs and stuff with Kevin Sullivan. Yeah, he didn't cut. They talked, didn't do promos. It was a real.
No, he
shame.
was a phenomenal talker too. Lewin and Curtis too. You know, those guys were cutting edge, like 20 years ahead of their time type promo guys. You know, and yeah.
What was the story with Stomper? Was he afraid of Billy Robinson? Didn't he walk out of a match, or what the hell was that all about?
Oh yeah. I don't know what the deal was. Stomper was the big. He was my dad's top heels back in about '69, and.
But he was he was a definite tough guy. Why would he? Well, maybe Billy Robinson was like the ultimate hooker shooter.
Dory Funk was just in his, just getting his kind of feet wet as the NWA champion, and Dory Funk came up at our big shows every year, and Calgary was this thing called Stampede Week, which was in July, and so I think Dory Funk came up in May to shoot an angle to work the match with Stomper, and they had a real barn burner match that ended on some technicality, and so Stomper challenged Funk to a rematch at Stampede Week up here, which is supposed to be in July, which is about 6-7 weeks later. And in the meantime, on that, I think Billy Robinson's first night was that night. He had just come in from Japan. My dad wasn't sure really what to think of him at that time. He came in fairly underrated, just sort of was going to work for a while, and Billy got over $1 million, a pretty dynamic face, and so my dad told Archie just to kind of set it, give him somebody to work with in the interim up till Stampede Week. He wanted him to do a program with Billy, and Stomper was pretty high strung though, and a little bit kind of too tightly wound at times, and. So they were working. They're supposed to work a 3 or 4 week program, and then Billy was supposed to put Stomper over so he could be poised to fight Dory again when he came in. And I'm not sure what happened there. I think they worked a couple of weeks, and then the third week Billy was supposed to do the job for Stomper, and so they're having their match, and all of a sudden Stomper stormed out of the ring, and it had been a really lousy match too. It kind of looked like they were half struggling, and when you have a shoot and the guys who work, it's not a very entertaining match, as Mike and Cueball could probably appreciate. It usually looks like two guys rolling around, and they did that for about 10-15 minutes, and my dad knew something was up, but the fans are just kind of boring and wondering what the hell's going on. And then Stomper squealed out of the parking lot and left in a huff, and so my dad instead had to have Billy Robinson work with Dory the next week. And
how was that match? That sounds like that could have been incredible.
it turned out to be an incredible match, and it was the match that sort of launched Billy, and it actually kind of went a long way to launching Dory Funk as the champion that he became. Like they had, I think they worked 2 weeks in a row and ended up having a 60-minute draw the first night, and people were on the edge of their seat. And next week was even better, and it kind of launched both of them. And
do you guys have footage? I don't know if you sold that to Vince, but was there footage kept of that, either of those matches or anything like that?
I'll have to check with my brother Ross, because that was.
I marked out anytime I could shoot a Billy Robinson match. I just mark out because it was so good. So I have to ask you: did Stu ever take him down to the dungeon? Can you imagine Stu taking another hooker shooter down there?
Oh yeah, he actually paved the floodgates for all the British guys that ended up coming to Calgary. The guys like Jeff Ports and Les Thornton and Angus Campbell and Kendo Nagasaki, and then later Dynamite and Davey and.
But did he take Billy down to the dungeon?
Billy was down there a few times, and my dad had this other old shooter that you probably heard of, who came in around that era, a guy named George Gordienko. And, And the funny thing with all those old shooters, though, if you get them down in the dungeon, very rarely would they lock horns with each other. They invariably would have some guinea pig or some guy that they would stretch the shit out of or demonstrate on, and that kind of thing.
Now,
very, very rarely did I see the Lindsays or the Gordienkos or the Gotchas or the Robinsons lock horns down there. It was always sort of more like, let me show you this one, or that kind of thing, and they'd have a few guys that were kind of the guinea pigs. But I know some of the guinea pigs that they had down there ended up becoming pretty decent half shooters themselves. I remember, like, way back in the day, there was a guy named Gordon Nelson.
Oh, what a tremendous wrestler! And he ends up. It broke my heart because he was on top in L.A. 2 years in a row, 72, 73. I think he almost went to the Olympics or something like that, or he did, and he was like silver medalist. But he was like a decorated amateur. And then to see him at the end, he and Grizzly Smith just setting up the ring for WCW with all the marks, not knowing how incredible these two guys are, particularly Gordon Nelson, who was very entertaining. And he worked with the likes of, it was just so awesome.
Yeah, I remember there was one
guy. And he has
a
son who's an MMA promoter in Amarillo near Terry Funk's old place, Steve Nelson, promoting MMA. Yeah. And I forgot who the mother was, but it was one of those.
Marie Laverne or Marie Laverne.
Yeah, Marie Laverne, who was an outlaw. She had nothing to do with Moolah, and so she was one of those great girls like Betty Nicolai or Jean Antone.
Yeah, and she was
Kay Noble and Vivian Deschamps. Had nothing to do with Moolah.
Her father and mother were both wrestlers, Ann Laverne and Roberto Pico.
Wow.
The old, so those are all sort of old blast from the past names that I remember from would work.
Well, Mike DiBiase's wife was a lady wrestler. Now, neither one of them were biological parents to Ted, but Helen Hild was a lady worker.
Oh yeah, I remember Iron Mike. He used to always come up. He worked Calgary for years with he'd come up with that old Danny Pletches.
Brent from Chicago is, I believe, joining us also on the line. Brent, how are you?
How are you guys? This is Ballistic Brent Myers out of Chicago, Illinois. You guys doing all right?
Hey, Brent. How are you, Brent? Hey. Good to hear from you. Hope you've been enjoying some of the commiserations with myself and Dr. Mike and Cueball.
I heard you guys mention, like the Battle Royals not telling much of a story, just meaningless, people getting tossed out left and right, no point behind it, or nobody taking their time to let fans register what they're doing. And if you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
We shall sell no wine before its time, as old Orson Welles used to say. Wrestling angles should be the same. You would, and I'm sure Mike would remember that. You would build some big angle for like 6-8 months a year. Even in WWE, they'd do that, where they'd have Andre and Hogan,
right.
finally it would culminate in the big WrestleMania thing. But you wouldn't just have Andre out of the blue come in and half an hour later he's wrestling Hogan on Monday Night Raw.
Well, look at what they did on the Nitro. They had Flair do something or other at the beginning of the show, and then they go, okay, at the end of the show we're going to have a hair match. And so Flair, like out of the blue, no build-up. Let me tell you, because of my experience, Tolis and Blassie, 1971, in the spring, they give Blassie this a trophy that supposedly the fans had voted on. Tolis destroys the trophy, throws this Monsel's powder from Dr. Bernard Schwartz's bag, a thing to stop cuts from, they use in boxing. He threw it in the ice. They stretched that out for however many months, 7-8 months. Each week, they'd show Blassie getting a little better in the hospital, and then they would have all of his former partners like Don Carson or Earl Maynard or Rocky Johnson or Emil Moskers, try to dethrone Tolis. And then finally, Tolis is wrestling, I think, and destroying Don Carson at the Olympic Auditorium. And who comes in and interferes with the match out of the blue but Blassie? And that sets up the outdoor Coliseum match where they broke the old Thez Baron Leone record for outdoor attendance. This is a 100,000-seat stadium. Now, granted, they only drew, I forget what it was, legit, maybe 33,000. But that was huge, loaded. Yeah. And underneath, so that was I think one of the longest feuds in the business, Blassie, Tolis. Underneath that, the second longest, or perhaps the longest in Brazil and Sheik. Just amazing stuff. And that's how you do it. And that's how most all good territories like Calgary.
Oh, yeah, Calgary is always doing that, where you'd have... Sure. I remember my dad had some old, kind of a retread who had kind of found a new life, sort of like rubber man Johnny Walker type guy named Dave Rule, and he used to do this thing with Sweet Daddy Siki, and they milked that for about a year before they finally collided, and that used to be fun to watch that stuff in the old days. I remember the Sheik and the Bobo, or Gene Kiniski and Dutch Savage were doing their thing in Vancouver, and it seemed like every territory they had some kind of long-running feud, like Sheik and Bobo, or they had. Something in Montreal with Mad Dog Vachon and Don Leo Jonathan or something like that. But that
was their first outdoor stadium show. That outdoor stadium show at Jerry Park in '73. Oh, yeah. It was actually heel versus heel. It was Mad Dog against Kowalski. Underneath that was Don Leo Jonathan against the Sheik. Can you imagine how great that must have been? And then Bruno and Carpentier against the Hollywood Blondes for the Grand Prix titles, the LeDukes. Wow. Everybody was on that show. Blackjack Mulligan and the opener, Vern Cinema.
And you would artistically and systematically build everything, not just
for
the main events,
year,
but
they
the
built
undercard.
Up Kowalski turning on Vachon a whole year.
That used to be the stuff that grabbed the people, or you'd have a guy that was being pushed as a face, and then, after however many months they would do a double cross, Did
the Sheik send Ron Pope Zulu to Stu first, or did Stu send... It was the other way around.
Eddie Farhat sent Ron Pope, and I'm sure you've heard all the Zulu stories and all
I
that.
Told you. Well, he came into our territory in '73, but I think I told you that at the end, when Roy Shire knew that Vern and Vince were coming, and he already said he was going to retire, and so so he's having his very last January Battle Royal. But the next month, both Vern and Vince were going to have Battle Royals in different venues in Oakland. And so first Shire goes to the LA Times, exposes the business totally to try to ruin California area for Vern and Vince in '82. And then once he retires, Ron Pope, that is Amazing Zulu, who did this native tribal warrior and was horrid in the ring, he and Bearcat Wright sued Roy Shire and sued him allegedly for racism and not pushing them, whereas Zulu was an opening match crappy guy, but Bearcat Wright was, when he wasn't effing around, he was a good talent, and Roy had put him on top with Stevens.
He was quite charismatic. He was kind of a earlier day version of some of these attitudinally challenged NBA stars, like sort of Dennis Rodman's and the Allen Iverson.
You can't take it away. He was one of those Jackie Robinson types, because in the earliest days, it was Bobo and Dory Dixon and Siki and Bearcat Wright and Art Thomas. Those were particularly Bobo.
Stu had them all up here, and maybe Luther Lindsay. They were kind of. And Bearcat, he had a ton of charisma, and he was a great interview, and he knew how to work. He knew how to get over. He would have been if he had been around in the Hulkamania days, he probably would have ascended to the top. Sort of had like that Dwayne Johnson type charisma, and he was a pretty likable guy, but he was just I think he was one of the guys who was partook in stealing my dad's airplane.
Listen to this. LeBell actually, his stepfather Cal Eaton, and of course Booker Jules Strongbow put the strap, the WWE World strap, on both Bobo and Bearcat Wright several times. And so they were the very first, and this was, they would defend that title in Japan for Ricky Dozan's group, etc., and up in San Francisco and different other places. So it was a real, quote-unquote world title. But the last time they wanted to get it off Bearcat, he wouldn't drop it to Blassie. So he screws around in the match, doesn't drop it to Blassie as he was told to do. And then out in the locker room, they finally sent Gene LeBell, hooker shooter, judo medalist, after him, and when he saw that Gene was coming, Bearcat allegedly dropped the belt, right in the parking lot and ran. And we didn't see him back for another 10 years.
Sorry to interrupt real quick. It's just we actually have two callers in right now. We actually have a different 618 area code. If you could introduce yourself real quick.
Well, hello, guys. This is promoter Bob Brooks. I heard you talking about the early days, and that I guess you talked me up. I come out of the 60s, 70s, and 80s era in Chicago, throughout the Midwest. I've promoted out of Chicago under Tri-State Wrestling back in the day when we had Windy City Wrestling, and
yes, sir.
I knew the name. I'll bring some. Yeah, I could throw out some names there. I mean, with Sam DeCero and Brad Davis. That was back when before he became the Undertaker. Of course, we had the Commando. Mark was wrestling as the Commando and training down in Kankakee, Illinois, and Bourbonnais, and that area.
Well, that was a great day for Chicago wrestling too.
It was, but you know what? I heard you guys throw out some really good Chicago names, though. I heard Blackjack Mulligan, Sailor Art Thomas. And you go into the Bruiser, Dick the Bruiser, WWA era, and of course, the amphitheater. And I don't know how far back you fellas will go with me on this, but I shot
6 times at the amphitheater. That was one of my absolute favorite venues, and the greatest, most fun riots. At least I wasn't part of it. I got out of that way, or went back to the dressing room with Bob Luce and his kid. Mm-hmm. But one of the great nights was in '75. I think August of '75. Bruiser and Crusher beat Nick and Ray to take the titles. That was the very last time Nick and Ray had the tag straps. The place went ballistic. There was no atmosphere. It was an amazing atmosphere, like second only to Madison Square Garden in the United States. The amphitheater was awesome. The wrestling there was awesome. This was in the period when FERPA was teaming with Joe LeDuc against the Valiants, like in opening matches, and Billy Robinson against Nick, and Baron von Raschke, when von Raschke could really go. He wasn't a joke. He was, still kind of that Olympic wrestler, amazing. Horst Hoffman and Jeff Ports, just amazing stuff.
Oh, yeah, there was some blasts from the past. I remember an old guy named Moose Cholak in Chicago. I don't know if he was around in those days.
Yukon Moose, yeah.
Yeah, I remember hearing that name.
Moose, a lot of the boys said that he'd never bathed, and that the Moose's head, which he finally stopped carrying the ring, was never washed.
Well, it took a couple of guys to carry that thing,
would team with Moose
on the horns of a dilemma
here. Like to bathe. That was a running gag in Illinois, at least when I was touring around with the AWA with Mike Gratchner, who ended up being a promoter in Indianapolis and Chicago.
I know Mike, yes. So Yukon Moose Cholak, he was a superintendent for the streets department in Chicago. Had a really good job, during the week. And, Moose was, just a Chicago icon, of course. But, I wanted to bring up a point that you guys were talking about, if I could. Because we always get the comparison today, versus back in those days. I think why it was so easy back in those days was because it was very simple. The characters that you saw were not very much different from their true, persona outside of the ring. Dick the Bruiser was a tough guy, Bobby Heenan, while he backed away from everybody in the ring, was a tough guy. These guys, made transitions from football and were genuinely, I know you mentioned the Sheik and Sailor Art Thomas. These guys were strong. They didn't have to become somebody. They were already somebody. And I mean, that's my take on it. I mean, I had Baron von Raschke and Abdullah the Butcher and guys like that working for me, but they weren't that much different. You know what I'm saying? And I know, Bruce, I'm sure you saw both sides of the fence every day at home, but these guys they didn't have to, you know what I'm saying, build on that character for weeks,
the characters
months, years.
A lot more. Most of them were pretty much, just manifestations of themselves with a little bit of, creative elements added. But, you didn't have guys that were playing roles that were totally departure from who they really were. And like you said, most of them knew how to wrestle. They could handle themselves. And, the people respected them, too. They carried themselves, with some majesty or whatever. And I don't see that all too often today. It's one of the things that's kind of lacking, among other things. So
absolutely loved historic Chicago wrestling. That was one of the 3 syndicated programs. There was Jules Strongbow out of Hollywood, or Santa Monica Legion Stadium. Of course, the Capital Sports out of the Northeast, and then from Marigold Arena in Chicago.
Fred Kohler.
Yeah, Fred Kohler. That was major.
Another name that was big in there was old Wilbur Snyder, I believe. He was another guy that...
He was Bruiser, yeah. He was Bruiser's partner for the WWA out of Indianapolis, and then they sort of worked with Vern, and Luce was kind of their figurehead go-to guy in Chicago. But that was basically a unification of Vern and Bruiser in Chicago.
I remember
and did I see great matches there? Out of the blue, they would throw out Ray Stevens in a 20-minute Broadway with Pat O'Connor. That it was outstanding, and both guys were old by that point in '74.
Still knew their way around the ring, I'm sure, though.
Oh, yeah.
Jim, I know you've been waiting a little longer, so I want to make sure that we got you and got your comments in real quick.
Yes, sir. My comment is about the CAC this year. It was my first year, mine and my family's first year going to CAC. And I must say I was thoroughly impressed with every aspect of it. You guys are like truly, from what I've seen and read in books and I've seen on TV and articles, papers, the whole thing, you guys are truly like one big family. And I really appreciate the time that everybody took with me to chat with me. Mike, I chatted with you a bit, as I know you're a busy man, and I really appreciate that. But this leads into my next question, due to the family aspect of it. We talk about a lot of families about professional wrestling, like the Von Erichs, the Funks, the Briscoes, the Malenkos, the Kaniskis, the Gagnes. But being from Canada, there's one family that a lot of people seem to forget that they don't realize, and that's the Hart family. A lot of the wrestlers today and a lot of different organizations owe a lot to Bruce, like your dad, for what your dad done for him and bringing him up, and a lot of the top stars. And it would be really nice, Bruce, to see you at the CAC next year and have your own, like a Hart Dungeon seminar to show some people stuff like that, right?
Bruce has been there before. When we had like all of the best amazing teachers. Bruce and Ross were there with Killer Kowalski, and there was quite a few guys. There was Buddy Rose and Ed Wiskowski, who taught guys in the Pacific Northwest. But the highlight was Bruce. So I don't think anyone takes the Hart family lightly, because I pretty much view them as the top family ever in the biz in terms of influence, everything that who did.
No, don't take me like that, Mike. And if I upset you, Bruce, I'm sorry, but a lot of the younger generation, like you see people looking at, like they forget what his business started at, where his family started at, and it started with people like your dad, right?
I think you don't need to kind of extol our virtues to guys like Mike and Cueball. They being ardent wrestling people and historians, they're well aware of the legacy or what came out of Calgary. I think to a certain degree, at times WWE makes mention of the dungeon and a little bit of that, but like they've done with so much of pro wrestling, they sort of like Stalin after, or Chairman Mao, they rewrite history, and there's not very much cognition of all the guys that actually did come out of Stampede. Like back in the day, a lot of people probably don't even know guys like Billy Graham came out of there, or back in
Jake Roberts, JYD, all those
Jake
guys, right?
Abby.
Yeah, Abby and Stomper, and back in the 60s, guys that later on became stars. Nobody knew that maybe they had worked extensively in Calgary when they were kind of getting their feet wet. Guys like Johnny Valentine and the Tolis brothers, almost all those Hamilton guys, and all those French-Canadian guys like the Vachons and the
yes, sir, exactly.
all them kind of got their break or got their feet wet in Calgary. I remember all those guys working in Calgary way back in the day when I was a little kid, and they were guys like the Tolises and the Bill Millers and the just a myriad of all these guys that later on, the Johnny Valentines and the Don the Spoiler Jardine and Stan Stasiak and guys like that, and they were just sort of working undercard back in those days in Calgary, and they there was about 3 or 4 territories that were considered like the great learning territories in Calgary. Calgary is one of them. I think Amarillo was another one. Portland was another one where these guys would really have a chance to kind of hone their craft, and it was a good working environment. And so many of those guys would you'd see them somewhere else, and they had evolved into mega stars, and I think
Bruce,
that's one
let
of the
me say
things.
something quickly for about a minute on Cauliflower Alley. For this gentleman, if this was his first CAC, hopefully the night 2, the Baloney Blowout, which was that was probably our most depressing Baloney Blowout ever. Most of the time it's very uplifting, but there was some business they had to get through. Cowboy Bob Kelly's wife passing away, and then they had somebody. Bruce had been vilified wrongly because he spoke
10
his
years
mind.
ago, yeah.
He was there for 2 speeches, and he talked about all the problems in WWF at the time. And I was telling Cueball before we went on live that I was sitting next to Jack Briscoe and Paul Jones, the wrestler Paul Jones, not the old promoter. And they both, and here's the guy who put the kibosh on Ole Anderson's NWA and basically hand-delivered TBS television to Vince Jr. by selling, the Briscoes sold their shares to Vince. But Jack Briscoe and Buddy Colt and Paul Jones, amongst many, were giving Bruce a standing ovation for what he said because he spoke truthfully and from the heart. But he was vilified because the guy that has had all this power over CAC, thought Bruce went on long, and he was sweating in his pants because he certainly didn't want to offend WWF, because
Carl
we're
Lauer,
kissing their butt. So we have a guy that we gave a fan award out to at the Baloney Blowout. Now, the next night was fine, although giving a Lou Thez award to Michael Hayes, it was weird. They should have shifted those 2 top awards. And Michael Hayes even said, his words, I'd be the first to admit I sucked in the ring. I normally would get in there, take some bumps, give the hot tag to Terry Gordy, and blah, blah, blah. And Thez is spinning his grave. They should have reversed it, to a more athletic trainer-type guy, give the Thez award to Terry Taylor, and then give the more show-busy award, the Mike Mazurki award, to Michael Hayes, because that award used to be primarily for people who had transcended wrestling in the movies and TV. That would have been perfect for Hayes. So back to night 2 of the Blowout. This guy that supplanted Bruce Hart as, the villain, the quote-unquote bogus villain of CAC at the mic, this guy's getting a fan award, and he first trashes WWE by saying that they're not sensitive to gay wrestlers and the hepatitis C problem. But then he tries to kiss their ass a couple of paragraphs later, and he starts saying, well, they were trashed by Nancy Grace on the Headline News Network when she was listing all these wrestlers that died of drugs, and she stupidly included Owen Hart in there, who, was not. Owen fell. You know all that. He's talking about all this stuff, and he never once really talked about himself being a fan or thanked CAC's board of directors for giving him this award. It really put a downer on the evening. It was the most out there thing we'd ever had at the mic. So I want you to know that normally the Baloney Blowout, very uplifting. We have so many awards, they spill over, and now they have the Baloney Blowout. They give half of the lesser awards on the Tuesday night, and then the next night is our main event, our big awards banquet where all the top awards are. But I'll shut up. But anyway, Bruce, you're no longer the heel at the mic. It was this guy. I won't say his name. Who got a fan award.
That's too bad. I still haven't been invited back. I've been, kind of blackballed in like CAC's version of Shoeless Joe
Ross
Jackson.
is there every year, and you know what? Teddy, who I thought might have been, he might have done something. Teddy was a perfect angel last year when he came. Teddy Hart.
Wow.
An angel with horns and a tail.
Pitchfork.
He behaved himself.
Any last words, Jim? Any last words,
Jim?
I
just hope that Bruce, that you can go back this year, go back to the 50th, because I've already got my vacation booked. You guys got a member for life right now. I just really appreciate your time. Everybody did take the time to have a picture with me. Right?
I'm not sure if the brass has, put aside all their, petty
but
bullshit.
Bruce, I wanted you to know that Jack Briscoe gave you a standing ovation. He really was into what you were saying, because I think all these wrestler deaths way too young that you were speaking about, unnecessary wrestler deaths from, what they...
Oh, yeah, I was paying... most people almost forget that was the point of my whole speech, was I was paying tribute to all those icons at that time who had passed away, including Blue Thez and Tim Woods and Eddie Farhat and all these others, and I was just basically saying that other sports they've lost icons. Like at that time was like guys like Johnny Unitas and Joe DiMaggio and all that, but they're replacing them with a new breed of superstars. But wrestling is not doing that, in part because of
all
WWE.
Those guys have died. All those guys from the 80s and 90s. If you look at all the guys who were on the ECW roster, most all of them are gone, sadly, including Sherry Martel. That's awful.
The foundation is crumbling, or it's pretty shoddy right now, and doesn't bode well for the future of the business. I'm hoping that some of the initiatives we have, help fortify the foundation.
It's a shame we'll never go back to the territories, but at least we have our memories, because that was the absolute best period. I think the 70s, the 60s and 70s, so amazing. Every territory unique from top to bottom, the announcers, everything, the way the booking style was, everything was awesome. And the indies are not the territories. The indies are not the territories. There are some great indies, Ring of Honor, Chikara, Dragon Gate, USA, APW, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, but they ain't the territories.
The one thing that Bruce and I constantly agree on and always talk about is we have to get back to what once was, to rebuild this business to what it should be.
You need to go back. You need to have the wrestling, so-called wrestling, actually wrestling set up the high spots and all the other stuff, and you need to go back to square one, and I think it's perfectly possible, but I think WWE, as I said countless times, they should be embracing and they should be supporting these independent or whatever you want to call them.
They're looting them. They're looting all the talent, like Prince Devitt. They're looting them.
They're raping and pillaging, but they're not supporting them. Like that was what they did back in the day in Calgary. They were happy to take Dynamite and Davey and Brett and Owen and Benoit and Jake and Junkyard and whoever the hell, but they weren't doing anything to help Calgary. They weren't giving Stu 2 cents, or they weren't lending any help or support or anything, and they're doing that all over the place. They were taking whatever Vern had or whatever Crockett had or whatever Eddie Graham had or Fritz had or whatever the hell. They're more than happy to take all their stars, but they did. They systematically went out of their way to wipe out those territories, and and they're paying the price for it
I wonder
now.
if the landscape guys would have been different if Eddie Graham hadn't committed suicide. I think it was 82, and Eddie Graham was there with Bill Watts and Vern and Jarrett. If they might have had a chance with the quiet wisdom of an Eddie Graham, who knows?
Yeah, the only guy. Part of the problem, I think you and I discussed it a few times on the side mic, but it was the fractured bullshit going on in the NWA.
Well, they all wanted to be king. No one wanted to be.
They're all screwing each other. Up, back in the 70s and the early 80s, the NWA was a pretty strong, cohesive unit. There was a few assholes, but for the most part, and then after a while it became kind of very fractured, and down in the southeast they were pretty much, controlling it and basically saying screw Stu Hart and screw Don Owens and screw, whoever else. And that was one reason why Vince Jr. had, as easy a time as he did when he came in. They screwed us a few times. They were supposed to send Harley when he was the champion, and I can't remember if it was Dusty or who the hell called Stu up and said, Harley can't make it. And my dad basically said, screw it, and he started bringing in Burns, Nick Bockwinkel, the AWA champion, even though Stu had been a charter member of the NWA, but they kind of screwed themselves, the NWA, and that was one reason why Vinny's takeover in the mid-'80s was as easy as it was, because there was nothing, no solidarity, none of them were helping each other, and I think right now Vinny's kind of in a position where it would be in his best interests if there was some strength, and the grassroots are re-sowed, and they need to be. The grassroots of the business are pretty fragile right now, if they even are at grassroots anymore. And that's one of the things that really needs to be fortified tremendously. And
we got to get back to that, because that's what this industry is lacking. My daughter, she just phenomenally sooner see the old school stuff than the new school stuff. It's just so much better, right?
You got it.
Okay, boys, thank you very much.
You guys, I'm going to have to go, but let me say a couple of things about Vegas. Some positive things about Cauliflower Alley. One was Destroyer Dick Beyer, who there's no bigger legend in Japan, etc., than the super intelligent
How's Dick
Destroyer.
doing these days, Mike?
He's opened something. He and Wilma, he's doing good. He still has the walker like Harley Race. But he's opened up a variant of Japanese golf called Park Golf. He actually has his own Destroyer Park Golf greens. It came out of Japan in '83. It's a hybrid of traditional golf and ground golf. But at his complex, he's got his own Destroyer Wrestling Museum and restaurant, and he's got Dr. X. That's the stupid thing. When he came into AWA, Vern said, well, I'm not going to use your Destroyer gimmick. We're going to call you Dr. X, which is insane, because internationally, he was the Destroyer. He was a multi-time WWA World Champ. He held TV records against Ricky Dozan and Baba in Japan as a Destroyer. But anyway, so he sells all that stuff. But can you imagine? It's like the old Mad Dog's hamburger places all over Quebec. Destroyer Restaurant, Destroyer Museum, Wrestling Museum. A little person's legend, young legend he's sort of semi-retired. Short Sleeve Sampson got an award. He gave a really moving speech, and he talked about all the greats. Obviously, Sky Lolo and Little Beaver and Little Bruiser and Little Crusher.
He's a good guy, Mike.
He really is a nice, super nice guy and a great hand in the ring. And I didn't know that Short Sleeve Sampson was like mini Undertaker. He was the mini guy in a lot of those skits. It wasn't just Tiger Jackson in the 90s doing all the dink stuff, but Short Sleeve Sampson has done his own wealth of stuff. He did a mock DX, and he was the little mini Undertaker and a couple of these other guys. So that was cool to hear that.
Yeah, he's a good guy. He really is.
He's from I didn't know he's from like the New York, Jersey area, I think.
I feel sorry for those poor little bastards these days, because there's tough for them to even find work. I see the odd time recycle Hornswoggle or
Little Louie and King Sleazy all the time. Great guys.
Back in the day, they had a job, and they would be able to travel around. And with the coming of the WWE, it seemed like most of the poor bastards were out at work, which is too bad, because there was a lot of them. I don't even know whether some of them are still alive. The little Tokios and the Coconut Willies.
We lost Little Tokyo. He was another Lord Littlebrook guy. He passed. He was a great
phenomenal worker. Yeah, and guys like Cowboy Lang and Cowboy Bradley and a bunch of them. They were Frenchie Lamont, all those guys. But good guys. And they took a lot of pride in their craft. always had a lot of respect for them, you know.
And then the women midgets. The really cool thing is a couple of years ago, we always used to get Katie, Diamond Lil to come, but Darlin Dagmar, there was like only 2 female midgets in the 60s and 70s, and they really had to work hard touring the U.S. So Darlin Dagmar, the blonde one, came babyface about 5 years ago to CAC.
Oh, Cheryl Page or something.
Man, she's awesome. She is like best buddies with, both Debbie Combs and Joyce Grable, who's getting back from her, her hospital stay. She's coming back strong.
I was Joyce.
Can you imagine? Like only 2.
Worked a lot with Debbie Combs in the 90s.
Yeah, I remember Debbie Combs. And
Debbie Combs is another one who Leah Maivia in Honolulu owes a big amount of money to.
Yeah, I remember Debbie Combs and Donna Day and old Cora Combs is Debbie Combs' mother and all like that.
Here's how I got to go. I'm going to leave you with this, and it also involves Cauliflower Alley. I had nagged Roy Shire, who sadly I heard his wife Dorothy, his widow Dorothy, has been put in like a nursing home, and they're selling most of his memorabilia. WWE just paid allegedly $10,000 for Roy Shire's professor's cap and gown from 1959 and all that stuff, but they don't even have any idea of what a tremendous, guy on a lot of levels Shire was. So Roy had come to my old Canvas Cavity TV taping many, many times, and he said some stuff that perhaps he shouldn't have said. And I remember even Rocky Johnson and Bruno both verified that at one of the last times Bruno was in San Francisco, Rocky begged him to get him out of there because he thought Roy was a little racist. So he's in a 6-man with Pepper Gomez and Bruno. I forget who they were working with. But anyway, so finally it was, I guess it was 93. It was 1993, and Roy agrees, and he said, only if you drive us down there. And I'd nagged him for years like I had Pampero Furpo to go to Cauliflower Alley. So we go down there, and basically we're coming to the finish. He sees Buddy Rogers with his back turned, and Buddy's best friend and longtime in-ring manager and legit manager, Bobby Davis, who was like the predecessor to the Grand Wizard and all the great managers that came. And he sees that both of them have their backs turned, and he goes up and elbows Buddy in the back really hard, so Buddy spills his drink all over himself and Bobby Davis. And Shire then says to me, now I can go home. Now I can die happy. And this was over Cora Combs, who in 1955 or 54, Buddy Rogers had stolen. She was dating and sleeping with Roy Shire, allegedly, and then Buddy Rogers took her away from Shire. So we have, like 50 years later, this heat finally comes to an end, and Roy gets his revenge. And within a year, both had died from freak accidents. Buddy slipped. Somebody had him sign something, a mark at a supermarket, and then the hospital gave him an antibiotic that he had a known allergy to, and we lost, perhaps the greatest in-ring, worker, not a Thez-type worker, but a worker, right. Buddy Rogers. And Shire died. They both died soon after this. And I'm just going, what a waste to have harbored this heat. And that happens so much in wrestling, 30, 40, 50 years, and want to get your revenge and all that. Life is too short, but that was promoter Roy Shire and wrestling legend Roy Shire.
It's an interesting story. That's exactly why I was delighted that a guy like you'd be on the show tonight, Mike, and Cueball, because there's this wealth of kind of wrestling history and insightful perspective, and that is what kind of fascinates me, where you can kind of you mention a name like Cora Coombs or something like that, and
she was quite the looker. Even Johnny Mae Young was quite the looker back in the 40s and 30s.
Oh, yeah, Penny Banner, Lorraine Johnson.
Oh, she was hot.
A lot of people don't even remember that some of those were kind of fathers or mothers of some of the guys that came along, like Baby Doll, I think, was Lorraine Johnson's.
Right, a daughter of Nick Roberts, which is interesting because they called her Nicola after Nick Roberts, her dad, her wrestling father.
Yeah, and I remember both those guys being up in Calgary back in the 50s, Lorraine Johnson and Penny Banner, and none of them made the WWE Hall of Fame, I might add, But,
which is stupid because, like, the two Lou Thez, Billy Robinson, Stu Harts of women's wrestling, the absolute cream of the crop, and Mildred Burke and June Byers, they were without peer, the absolute greatest.
They were, and
they're not in that stupid Hall of Fame. It's crazy. WWE has to get off their ass, and it can't be a Hall of Fame in Vince's mind or a gimmick to sell DVDs. In order to buy the full Hall of Fame prior to this year with a network, you had to buy the 3-disc DVD. Even if you'd already paid for the pay-per-view and watched it, you had to buy the whole WrestleMania 3-disc set just to get the Hall of Fame disc. They would not sell the Hall of Fame disc by itself. Now, I heard you could buy it this year online, so that's a good step forward for them, so I'm applauding them on that. But the fans want to see that, and you want to let those guys go. And, can we not just have Scott Hall types going into this Hall of Fame? Let's get some really, truly deserving people, like June Byers or Penny or Mildred Burke.
Yeah, and yet I see guys, and not to denigrate them, but I see guys like Coco Beware or, Mike Von Erich and stuff like that, and it's kind of like, none of those guys, like Mike Von Erich never worked WWE, so if you're going to have non-WWE guys, then, why isn't Thez or Gotch or Hackenschmidt or Lewis or Stecker or Londos or Shekat or Everett Marshall or Bobby Manigoff and all those guys, they're like giants of their time,
Well, the original Sheik was actually inducted, and coming from a fan's perspective, even we question Coco Beware being inducted. Mike Von Erich, I can see just because they inducted the entire Von Erich family together, Kevin, David, Kerry, Mike, Chris, and Fritz. But Coco Beware, even we as fans question.
I've had some of that dialogue with Vinny and them, about Owen. I've said
how come Owen should have been in there a long time ago.
Yeah, and whether they pulled some pranks on the road or wherever, Dynamite and Davey were as iconic a tag team as they've ever had in there, and they were also world class around the world in Japan and all like that. Yet they're not in there, there's a lot of.
How much money did Dynamite and Davey and Owen make for that company? Tons.
Yeah, and they were on top, so they're, so I can't fathom why they're not in there yet. Yeah, there's a myriad of guys that couldn't carry their jock straps that have been put in there in the last few years. That.
If they induct Outback Jack before Dynamite Kid, there's no hope.
It may well be. I'm fully expecting something like that, or the Gobbledygooker, or the damned, Giant Gonzalez, or some damn thing, to go in before the British Bulldogs or Owen or whatever, But I think that's
going to get me mad. You guys, I have to leave, but that leaves finally, deservedly, the great Cueball Carmichael, because I've been hogging the show. So Cueball, you're in good hands with the great.
You weren't hogging it either, Mike. You're doing a hell of a job.
It's a great history lesson for me.
Q hasn't been able to talk, so now Q will finally have a chance to talk with Bruce. Everybody love and support the territories, and again, thank God for our memories. Talk to you guys later.
All the best, Dr. Mike.
When I listen to Dr. Mike, I get a history lesson. So I just sat here with my jaw agape, and I listen and take it all in.
Yeah, beyond everything else, I'm sort of a big, passionate wrestling fan aside from everything else. So it's always a pleasure for me to hear guys like Dr. Mike or yourself, Cueball, or some of these other guys that have been around. There's a bunch of them, Johnny Mantell and some of those guys like Mike Mooneyham down in, Carolina there, and Kurt DeBoer. But yeah, it's always a pleasure just hearing some of the stories about the territories. That's one of the sad things for me these days in the business is a lot of the modern fans don't have any idea about so many of those guys. If you're a baseball fan, every kid, myself included, they know of Mickey Mantle, or they know of Babe Ruth, or Ty Cobb, or Christy Mathewson, or Mel Ott, or whatever. But nobody, not too many of today's wrestling fans know anyone beyond maybe Hulk Hogan era. They don't know about the Hackenschmidts and the Gotches and the Shekats and the Toluses and the Blassies and the Millers and the Scotts and the Von Raschkes or the Crusher and Bruiser and all like that, And those guys were all iconic, larger-than-life characters that, they were the guys who made the business and paved the way for the Hogans and Daniel Bryans and all like that. And nobody even unfortunately, other than maybe the old farts and a few guys that have maybe heard stories, have any idea who any of those guys are, which is too damn bad. It's like he was saying there, like Lou Thez is one of the probably the equivalent of like a Joe DiMaggio or a Gordie Howe. If you're a real wrestling fan, I'd just like to point out to all you listeners that there was a wealth of incredible, talented, charismatic, dynamic, bombastic stars like long before Hulk Hogan, that all been sort of painted out of the picture. But I consider myself lucky that I had the opportunity growing up in the business to kind of see it from every perspective as a wrestler, and then I was kind of the booker of the Calgary territory all through the late 70s and the early 80s, so I developed all those guys like Dynamite and Davey and Brett and Jake and Junkyard and Benoit and Owen and all those guys. But I had the opportunity to see it from both sides, so I know what promotions and promoters are looking for, but I also know what it's like to be breaking in, and I was pretty much the primary trainer during that stretch. We had to develop all our own talent, so it was sort of a sink or swim thing. I had to kind of know what the hell I was talking about, or we would not have attained any success. So I'm hoping that in the next little while we maybe can revive and revitalize some of these promotions, like in Carolina, which used to be one of the best in the world, and maybe Florida, Ohio, up here, maybe California. Those are all places that used to be vibrant, dynamic, cornerstones of the wrestling business. So I'm hoping that some of these initiatives evolve into, laying the groundwork for the foundation of the wrestling business.
It's a pleasure being on with Bruce every time I get a chance to be, and I have no more respect for anybody in the business than Bruce and his family, and it's just great to be associated with him at this point in my career, and I'm looking forward to doing some great things with him in the future.
I'd just like to thank all the listeners for taking out of their busy schedules to tune in and check us out, and I'd love to hear any perspective, and I'd love to invite any of you listeners to feel free to call in anytime, and all the best, Pat. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and away we go with another edition of the Stampede Wrestling Show.